Thanks for all watching today. I've got a lot of great content to cover here for you, so I'm really excited to step through our content today. So again, we're here learning about, your most critical Office 365 vulnerabilities and how to fix them, right? And, we've already done some of our welcoming introductions here. I'm also going to take a few slides here to kind of introduce who Hornetsecurity is, what we do briefly, and then we're going to really dig into the content you're here to listen to today. We're going to talk about the threat landscape and how threat actors are using M365 in the wild today. We're going to talk about O365 credential phishing, Active Directory Connect and syncing with hybrid environments. We're going to get into insufficient and incorrect MFA settings, malicious application registrations, and OAuth authentication. And then we're going to talk about briefly business email compromise attacks as well. And then finally, we've got some wrap-up material at the end along with the Q&A. We've got a couple of resources to share with you to get a little bit more information on the subject in case you want it after the session today. And as Roger mentioned, we will have a little bit of time for a Q&A at the end. And again, we'll be sure to cover as many of those as we can. But otherwise, we'll be sure to get back to you after the show if we didn't get an answer to your question. Or on my speaker slide here, my Twitter handle is @Syrewicze. Apologies, you'll have to spell the last name. I have a friend who tells me I should change that to @AndySandwich. That's an old schoolyard joke from back in the day. But today you'll have to spell the name. My apologies on that. Anyway, so let's talk about Hornetsecurity real quick. So we are the most comprehensive cloud security service for Microsoft 365, and we really do it all. We do spam filtering, we do compliance, email encryption, continuity, backup and recovery. We don't just do that for Microsoft 365, while that's an area we focus on. We are also able to do that for, on-premises Exchange, Google Apps, and other mail services, like Postfix or any of the other weird open source mail servers that are out there. On top of that, we also can provide hosted mailboxes with full end-to-end security. We do web security, and also from the Altero suite of products, we also provide the backup and recovery for VMware and Hyper-V as well. Now, Roger mentioned we've got 9 redundant data centers around the globe. This slide is a little bit dated in that we actually have 18 offices now. We have an office in Canada, in addition to all the other ones on this slide. So we are a global company. We are all over the place and are growing at a pretty impressive pace here. So the company really got started back in 2007, and really focused on things like archiving and email encryption. And then as time went on, more interest in cloud services became a thing. Really started to focus in on the Microsoft 365 platform. And recently, the company's been making a lot of strategic acquisitions to really round out that product portfolio, to really bring our customers holistic security end-to-end for their M365 environments. We handle that so you can focus on what it is that you do, right? As an IT pro, you have enough headaches to worry about on a day-to-day basis without having to worry about M365 security. So we're definitely a trusted partner in that space. And, we love to help you do what it is you do in your organization. So let's talk about the threat landscape. Excuse me. And what I want to start with is some data. Now, we did a variation of this webinar a few months back. It's a little bit different formats, but as part of that webinar, we ran a poll, and we polled the attendees and said, hey, what are your biggest concerns with security today in Microsoft 365? And we gave them a number of different choices, and this is what we came back with. Now, if you'd asked me before the poll what the number one item was going to be, I would have said ransomware. So I was a little bit surprised by this. And in terms of sample set, we had, I think this is a sample set of like 250, 300-ish responses. Phishing was the number one concern. And, it kind of makes sense once I started thinking about it, because phishing is really kind of the first step in for the threat actor, right? They're going to try and harvest some credentials to gain access to the environment in some way, shape, or form. And then that's where the ransomware is going to take an effect. Or that's where they're going to do additional credential theft and go sell it on the dark web, right? And then finally trailing in it, fourth and fifth place, we had the malicious applications and governance and monitoring. So let's talk about a little bit more data. Now that particular webinar, that variation of this webinar I talked about, we actually worked with a security response company. I've got some buddies over there. This company is called TrueSec, and every year they do a threat intelligence report. And this data that you see here is based off of their 2021 edition of that threat intelligence report. And these are all incidents that they respond to. So all the data that you see here are real life incidents from this report. And if we start on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got attack types in the year 2020. Obviously, no surprise here, ransomware is like half of that chart, right? 49 of the incidents they responded to were ransomware incidents, with 17, the next one from the right of that, business email compromise attacks. So that would be your typical CEO, CFO fraud, where the threat actor, the goal for them is to either exfiltrate data or they're trying to exfiltrate money from the organization in some way, shape, or form. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in the session. And then the other big one there, the 21, is the access harvesting. Now that would be, again, I mentioned exfiltrating user credentials for sale on the dark web. That's a very lucrative business for those people that do that. So that's why it's so prevalent. And I mean, they do access harvesting via a number of different methods, right? You could have your traditional brute force where I have 1 or 2 user accounts and I'm going to hammer on them 10,000 times until I guess it properly, but that's fairly noticeable, right? We have controls in place commonly in IT today that are designed to detect brute forcing. So another more common thing that we're starting to see now is password spraying, which I always explain is kind of like the inverse of brute forcing. So instead of brute forcing, where, like I said, I have 1 or 2 accounts that I hit 10,000 times, it's the inverse. Password spraying is I have 10 or 20,000 user accounts, and I may quietly try 2 common passwords across all of them in an automated fashion. So, for example, we're coming up on fall of the year 2021. Maybe I'll try fall 2021 as my password across those 10 or 20,000 user accounts, and maybe I'll get lucky with one of them, right? And then I'll use those credentials to infiltrate further into the environment and continue to go after whatever I'm going after. So then on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got attack vectors. So we talk about what the attack types were. How did they get in? And the big number here, which I find very interestingly lines up exactly with the top concern that we saw from the previous slide, is phishing. 39 of these instances, the attack vector was some user getting phished. And we're going to talk about that in the next section of the session here. We had 11 remote service logons. So maybe they had harvested credentials from somewhere. Maybe they bought them off the deep web, and they've remote service logon in some way, shape, or form. The other big one here that's worth mentioning is the 28 number, the vulnerability exploit. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is, while 28, that's a fairly large part of that particular graph, remember that we've had a lot of vulnerabilities lately. You think about the SolarWinds hack, the Exchange server issues that were going on. There's been a lot of vulnerability issues lately. So maybe this is the new norm. I hope it's not, but maybe it is. But I would think under quote unquote normal circumstances, maybe that number would be a little bit smaller. But for present day, this is where we're at. And then finally, the last thing worth mentioning there is the blue color, and that is trusted service and supply chain attacks, which we mentioned the SolarWinds deal. That falls into that category as well, those supply chain attacks. So that's kind of where the threat landscape is. How does that kind of line up with how threat actors are leveraging Microsoft 365? Now, I've kind of mentioned this a few times already, credential gathering. That's one of the big areas that threat actors are focusing on. They want to gather credentials to infiltrate environments, exfiltrate data, ransom data, or sell those credentials on the dark web. You've got spam campaigns. You know, M365 is like the largest provider of email services in the world. So it makes it a ripe target for spam campaigns and the phishing that goes along with that. We mentioned the business email compromise attacks. I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. So that's a very common attack vector here for M365. Mailbox and file data theft. Again, these are both areas where sensitive business data is contained. So they're going to use, you know, every avenue they have in order to exfiltrate that data out of mailboxes, out of OneDrive, out of SharePoint. So that's kind of another area. Credentials reused to access services. So I'm going to keep hitting this nail with a hammer, talking about illicit credential usage. That's very common with M365. You think about how much any given user inside of an M365 tenant has access to. Those credentials are going to be used to the fullest until they can find a user with more access and more access, right? Until they get up to that global admin account, which God forbid doesn't happen. But that's definitely something that they have their eyes on. And then finally, another key area of consideration as we have this conversation today is the fact that these threat actors will quite commonly, if they have no other foothold into the environment, they'll try to compromise the on-premises location first in a hybrid deployment, because the on-premises location is quite often more easily breached than the cloud service itself. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we step through the content today. All right, so the first of our 5 vulnerabilities that we're going to be talking about today is that credential phishing that I've already mentioned a couple of times. So we mentioned that, you know, in that first poll data you saw, this was the most common concern in terms of security for attendees. And this also lines up with the most common attack type that was cited in the 2021 TrueSec Threat Intelligence Report, right? So let's talk about credential phishing here. And the first thing I want to do is just kind of show some examples, right? I mean, people have seen a lot of examples of phishing attempts. When I was looking through this particular list of pictures, I recognized a few, but there were a few that surprised me as well. So, you know, when we talk about credential phishing, a lot of these have a lot of red. So some of these are from real incidents, so they have to be redacted. So that's why the red is, but you can still see the relevant bits as we're talking about phishing. So here we have an email. You can see that, hey, please see the attached invoice and advise. And you have what looks like an email attachment. Now, if your end user is not trained, they may not question this at all. Same thing here, just kind of a different variation. But you see that this one is actually signed by the Vice President of Finance. And if I'm your run-of-the-mill end user, I'm like, whoa, hey, the VP of Finance wants me to look at this. I better go look at it, right? Again, if they're not trained to question it, that might be a problem. A little bit more. This one I felt like was fairly cleverly crafted. It's not that hard for a threat actor to determine if your organization is using M365, and by extension, you know, they can make the assumption that you're using Microsoft Teams inside of your environment. So this email has been crafted to look like, hey, you've been added to a team in Microsoft Teams. And then, excuse me. And then, of course, they always have to put some sort of urgency factor into play here, right? And hey, we need you to follow up on this team urgently. And again, if the end user is not trained to go and look at the mail headers and the from and all that stuff, they may just fly right into this trap and boom, they're compromised. A couple more. This one really stands out to me by fact that they are actually linking to a SharePoint library. If I'm a standard M365 user, I know that SharePoint is part of my application set. I'm probably not going to question this, but in this particular case, the threat actor has already poisoned, has already compromised the SharePoint site, and they're now using that paired with, you know, a spam campaign to further infect and ransom and exfiltrate data from within that organization. So the user sees SharePoint, they say, hey, that's trustworthy, I know what that is, they click on it, and away they go. Here's another one. This looks just like the Office 365 login page, but if you go look at the URL, it's actually pointing to what looks like some sort of WordPress site instead. Again, designed to harvest those credentials. Here's another variation of it. Everybody has seen this login prompt. Anybody who uses M365, right? You know, most users, they're not even going to stop to think at this prompt. They're just going to type their password in, and heck, worst case, it doesn't work. So they try a different password and a different password, and they're giving up more credentials to that threat actor, right? And then finally, you know, I feel like we spend so much time recently, you know, in security conversations talking about ransomware and credential harvesting. We often forget that, you know, malware delivered directly via emails and spam campaigns is still a thing. And so that's what this particular example is. You know, hey, good morning, please see the attached proposal. And to kind of add a little bit of legitimacy to it, the zip password is 1234567. Not a very good password if you ask me. But anyway, that's another potential one that can cause issues. Again, all comes down to user training, right? So what can we do about this? You know, what are the recommendations? And one thing that you hear a lot lately in the security community and the IT community is kind of assume breach, right? That's one of the new postures that a lot of organizations are adopting. And part of that comes down to having MFA enabled as a minimum for this situation. If you have multi-factor authentication enabled for all your users and any of them stumble into any of these phishing issues that I just showed you, yeah, the password is compromised, but at least there's still that second factor that is stopping the threat actor from getting any further. Now, you have to pair that with a few other things, like you have to monitor risky events. You have to do, you know, the human aspect of security. You have to audit sign-ins, and you have to properly monitor events. You have to enable all the different identity protection features that are inside the M365 stack, or pull in a third party to do some of that stuff. You know, MFA by itself, while it's a great tool, that's not the whole equation, right? So, you know, what you really need to do is, one, have MFA enabled. Two, know that their password has potentially been compromised so that you can prompt them to go change it. And then three, you can also pair these things with a conditional access policy. Now, if you're not familiar with what conditional access is a feature in Azure Active Directory that can give you a little bit more granular control on users accessing different services and information inside of M365. So, for example, on the right-hand side of the screen here, I went and created a policy that I just called mobile device force hardened authentication. So in this, you know, hypothetical use case, we've got, let's say, a group of users called the sales team, right? And these are 5 users that are on the road. They're accessing M365 data from their mobile devices, and they might be, you know, in different countries, traveling all over the place. I want them to go through a little bit more of an authentication process to help verify that they are who they say they are. Conditional access allows me to do things like make sure that if they're logging in from iOS or Android, that they have to go through the MFA process, or do things like they're trying to access their email, they have to be doing it from an authorized application like the official Outlook app or something along those lines. So the conditional access allows you to do that type of stuff. It also allows you to make life a little bit easier for your end users as well. So if you have an office location, you can define that office location as a quote unquote, you know, safe place. And, you know, you can set up conditional access that if they're logging in from one of their secured locations, that they are not required to go through the MFA process. So again, you have a lot of options and ways here that you can tailor the MFA experience for your end users to, one, secure yourself, but also secure yourself in a way that doesn't overly burden your end users as they're trying to go about their day. So that is credential phishing in O365. Let's move on to Active Directory sync, Azure AD Connect, and hybrid environments. Now, I don't remember exactly what the statistic is, but a very large percentage of organizations throughout the world are they're slated to be using hybrid deployments for the foreseeable future, right? Very few organizations are entirely 100% cloud native. So hybrid is a very common deployment method these days. So you've got your on-premises resources, your workstations, maybe a few servers. You have your Active Directory environment on site, but you're also leveraging some Office 365 services, and you want your users to have that unified login experience. That way they can leverage resources from both locations without having login headaches and permission issues and all that, right? And that's where Azure AD Connect, this sync comes in. Now, what's the issue? Why is this one of the 5 critical vulnerabilities we're talking about today? Well, first is most on-premise AD environments are often neglected. And if yours isn't, if you really stay on top of yours, that's awesome. That's really great. You're probably in the minority, but I've spent a lot of time in the MSP space throughout my career, and I can tell you some stories about the rat's nests of Active Directory environments I've come across. I mean, situations where, hey, this AD forest has been around for 15 years, and the SQL service account from 2003 is still there, even though the server's not around anymore. It's still using the default password, and anytime anyone wanted to clean it up, didn't know what it was and was too afraid to delete it. Obviously, that's an issue, right? Now, pair that with the fact that, hey, if I'm now in a hybrid, deployment situation, and I want to sync Active Directory up into the cloud, if I just blanket sync everything to keep things easy, well, that potentially hazardous security account, that service account, I mean, is going up into the cloud as well. So when you set up Azure AD Sync, you really need to question whether you have to sync everything. So that's one of the common issues as well. Now, another couple of things with Azure AD Sync, this Azure AD Connect tool, is Microsoft themselves, even in their documentation, they will tell you that this service, whatever machine that this service is running on, it needs to be treated as if it's a domain controller, because it really does have that level of access. It has the ability to read the password hashes of your users and any account that flows through it. So that's another part of this issue, right? It has a high degree of access into your Active Directory environment, right, which is core to your security posture. So what can we do about this? And that's where these recommendations come from. First thing you should think about is dedicated cloud native administrator accounts. So you should have dedicated administrator accounts on the cloud side. That way you're not dependent on syncing the admin accounts over from the on-premises location. You should also not sync those service accounts that I just mentioned. It's so easy to, hey, I'm in a hurry. I have 10, 20 things on my to-do list. I need to get this AD sync set up. Oh, quick, sync everything, set it and forget it, and never come back and look at it again, right? So that's a problem. And then you also have to really kind of tier that Azure AD Sync service. Like I mentioned, it has the same level of access as a domain controller. So you want to make sure you limit access to it. You want to make sure that only the administrators, and only a subset of those administrators, have access to that tool to get at it and access it. So those are a couple of key things that you can do around your Azure AD Sync environment. Now, the next vulnerability I want to talk about, this is probably the one that's going to take us the most time, is insufficient and incorrect MFA settings. Now, there's been a very strong movement in the industry, thankfully, that multi-factor authentication is becoming a minimum in terms of authentication, right? Which is fantastic. The problem is that we're seeing a lot of situations now where those MFA settings are incorrect, or they're not they're not as hardcore as they should be, which is creating security holes, right? So I mean, threat actors, they're constantly evolving their techniques, right? Constantly figuring out ways around things like multi-factor authentication. So we have to make sure that these things are not only set up correctly, but we are revisiting them on a regular basis, which I'm going to talk about more here in a second. So really, what do we mean by insufficient or incorrect? I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory, but let's dig in a little bit further into the weeds here. So first off, MFA is not set and forget. Don't set up MFA and then never go look at it again. Because again, the security climate changes, right? Things change. You have to go back, reassess, reevaluate, and make changes. So don't set it and forget it. The other thing that we run into is that MFA settings are not reviewed or refined regularly. So an example of this, now what we consider to be legacy authentication methods are no longer secure because they can't call MFA in the M365 platform. So this would be things like IMAP, POP, SMTP. There's a whole documented list out in docs.microsoft.com of the various protocols that can't call MFA. So let's say you've gone to all the trouble of setting up multi-factor authentication for your environment and you still have IMAP installed for all of your users. Me, the threat actor, if I figure that out and be like, oh, hey, I can bypass MFA authentication by authenticating using IMAP, right? And now I have a foothold in your environment because IMAP was still enabled. Another thing that I find a lot of organizations don't really pay attention to is defining MFA policies using Azure Active Directory groups. Now, I'm not saying don't use Azure Active Directory groups to set up your MFA policies. It certainly makes things easier, but there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind if you're going to set it up this way. One, group memberships can change. So let's say I have, for an example, let's say I have an outside sales group in Azure AD, and this group, they're on the road, they're making sales, they're traveling, they're in unsecured locations, that type of thing. And then I also have an inside sales group, which is assisting that team, but they're in the office every day. Now I set up my MFA policies with these groups in mind, and now one of the inside sales reps gets promoted or makes a move into that outside sales team. So what's the IT organization going to do when that change comes through? They're going to go change his group memberships or her group memberships, and boom, now that particular user MFA is being handled a little bit differently, and it can change the way that they are authenticating to the organization, right? So it can, you make a change in Azure AD like that, you may not necessarily be aware that you're also changing the MFA mechanism depending on how you have MFA set up in your organization. The same thing can happen when you're nesting groups inside of Azure Active Directory. So just something to keep in mind. Again, not saying don't set up MFA using groups, just, again, something to keep in mind. Now, approved client applications goes hand in hand with legacy authentication changes. So I've talked about these legacy authentication methods, IMAP, POP, SMTP, MAPI. Like I said, there's a whole list of them. In conditional access, there is the option of making sure that the client is authenticating using an approved client app. The example I gave earlier was the official Outlook.com application on a mobile device. That goes hand in hand with legacy authentication changes. And then logins are allowed from anywhere by default. That's another big issue, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Now, what can we do about these insufficient and incorrect MFA settings? First thing I mentioned, conditional access policies. No legacy MFA settings, so none of that legacy authentication stuff. Getting ahead of myself a little bit here. So no legacy authentication settings. Now, most organizations, maybe they have a legacy application or an old server, or maybe they have some legacy SMTP relay that they have printers that utilize that. Maybe you're not sure. If you're not sure, there is a method in Azure Active Directory that allows you to see if any of these legacy authentication methods are being used inside of your M365 environment. So if you go out to Azure Active Directory, you come down into sign-in logs, you basically get a log of all the different authentications that are occurring within the environment. You can go up and add a column in the top right and say, hey, I want to add the client app column, and then you apply a filter to that column and select all these different legacy authentication protocols. So I've got Exchange Online, PowerShell selected, EWS, IMAP, and MAPI should be selected as well, but I neglected it in this particular screen. But anyway, once you apply that filter, you can go out and you can actually see what and who are using these old legacy authentication methods and use the administrator. You can go and make an informed decision like, hey, do we really need this still? Can we remove it? Can we migrate it to something more modern that uses modern authentication methods? And you can make an informed decision. Now, what else do we have here? You know, you want to disable legacy authentication, talked about that already. The third bullet point here, require MFA for all users. That's a big one. And if you ask me today, would I recommend this? Absolutely, for all users across the board. Now, not every organization is able to do that. You know, I think most IT pros, if you asked them if they should do all users across the board, most IT pros would say yes. But you start getting senior leadership into the room and you start talking to them about that, and they may have a different opinion. You know, if you're in that camp that you can't definitively say yes to all users, at a bare minimum, all administrative users should have MFA enabled. All administrative users as the bare minimum, but highly recommend all users have MFA turned on. Geofencing. This is another big one. So if you're a global enterprise organization, this may be difficult. You may not be able to do this, but if you're an SMB or an SME and you do business in Arizona and Canada, for example, go ahead and set up geofencing so that logins are only allowed from the US and Canada. You know, if you don't have people in China or Russia logging in, don't allow logins from China or Russia. That will greatly improve your security posture just in that change itself. The other thing you need to do is you need to review the conditional access policies regularly. Again, that human side of the SecOps equation here. Make sure you're reviewing the stuff on a regular basis. Make sure you're looking at the exceptions, asking questions. Does that exception really need to be here? Make sure you're asking those questions and making those changes as needed. Now, let's talk about malicious app registrations. And some people still aren't aware of what we really mean by that term. Think about how you use Office 365 or your users use Office 365, and maybe your user is going along their day and they hear about this handy tool for Office 365 or something that helps them organize their mailbox or some third-party app that does this cool thing in Office 365. They say, hey, yeah, I want to go download this and enable it. They go to enable it, and Office 365 gives you that OAuth prompt, right, and says, hey, these are the permissions that we're going to need. And the user, we've trained users to grant app permissions to get their work done. They're going to go ahead and allow that, right? They're probably not going to question it a whole lot. Or they may say, hey, this looks like it's coming from a Microsoft site. They're keeping me safe, right? Question mark, question mark. They'll just make that assumption. Now, really what can happen here is a threat actor can create an application and make it look legit. They publish it to Azure AD, and they can easily trick a user into installing it by making it look legit, right? Now, the problem with this is because the user has authenticated, they've created that session token, they've given the application access to the permissions it was asking for, MFA doesn't matter in that situation. They've completely bypassed MFA, and now the application has rights into the M365 environment that it asked the user for. So really what this attack can be used to penetrate further into the organization. And by default, users can grant any application access that's that you'll see here in a second. If you want a little bit more information on like the particulars and the specifics of this project, of this problem, we do have a blog post out on the Altera blog specifically about this. That's what you see in the link at the bottom of the screen there. Now, I mentioned this this permissions request. This is the screen I was talking about. I'm sure everyone's seen this. On the left-hand side, we've got the user permission where, hey, you know, this application would like to be given access to your data, read your contacts, read your mail. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got more of an administrative prompt, right? Hey, we want to look at all of your site collections. We want to see all of the mailboxes in the organization, or see all users' profiles, right? And that's what the big difference is between these two different prompt types. And what can we do about this? So the two big ones that you should do right out of the gate, even if you're setting up M365 for the first time today, these top two are ones that you should look at. Controlling who can give app consent and who can do app registrations. So if I drill into Azure Active Directory, and I go into enterprise applications and go into user consent settings, that is where this behavior is controlled. Now, these are the default settings. This is a fresh environment. This is the default settings. You can see here at the top, user consent for applications, allow user consent for apps. All users can consent for any app to access the organization's data. That is a huge glaring security hole. So any application, any user can allow access to the organization's data. Now, if you asked me which of these three options would I choose, I would choose the top option, do not allow user consent. And what happens in this particular situation is the user tries to authorize the application to access their environment or whatever permissions it's asking for, and they'll simply get a, you know, access denied type of message, and hey, an administrator will have to review this request, and an administrator will have to require access for the application. Now, if you're a small organization, maybe that doesn't work. Maybe you don't have the bandwidth to review every application. That's what the middle option is for, and it's kind of the middle ground, right? It allows users to authorize applications that have permissions that are classified as low impact. You know, maybe they don't require very deep access into the M365 data. And they can allow apps from verified publishers or any app that you've registered specifically within your O365 organization. So that's kind of the middle ground, like I said. So this, again, this is something you should go change to either of the other options. Do not allow your users to allow any application to access the organization's data. That's that's not a great place to be. So we're talking about, you know, controlling app consent and registration. What else should you do when we're talking about malicious application registrations? And again, here's another nail I'm going to keep hitting on the head. The human factor of IT security. You got to come back and you have to review your registered apps on a regular basis. If you see something that shouldn't be there, you need to revoke the access. And you have to have an internal policy of continuous evaluation. Maybe you have a change control board in your IT organization on a regular basis. You all go look, and you say, hey, what's this application? Oh, Bob in accounting needs that for reason A, B, and C. You have to be able to do those continuous evaluations, and there's a way to easily do that in Azure AD. Again, you come down into the enterprise application section of Azure AD, and I'm given a whole list of the different applications that have been authorized to the M365 tenant. You know, by default, these are all the defaults here, basically, with the exception of the bottom one. That's Hornetsecurity Threat Monitor is the bottom one. But you know, if I had an application here I didn't recognize, I could drill down into it. I could see who has access to it. I could see what permissions does it currently have within the M365 organization, and I could revoke the access if I needed to. So definitely a good portion of M365 that you need to be aware of. And then finally, let's talk about our last vulnerability area, and that is business email compromise attacks. So again, this would be those situations where you have CEO or CFO fraud, again, with the threat actor's goal being to exfiltrate data and or cold hard cache out of the organization, right? And I've personally seen one of these attacks myself. Back in my MSP days, the CFO of the organization got a very cleverly crafted email that appeared like it was coming from the CEO that said, hey, you know, I've got an urgent invoice that needs to be handled. Can you wire $15,000 to this account? And I kid you not, the CFO's finger was hovering above the submit button, and thankfully he questioned it. You know, I questioned myself whether, had we not been a tech-focused organization, whether, you know, he would have stopped long enough to question the authenticity of the email. But he stopped, he walked across the hall, said, hey, did you really need me to send this $15,000? And the CEO was like, wait, what $15,000? And surprisingly, after we involved the authorities, the attacker was ultimately caught, which is surprising, but just goes to show this type of attack can happen to any organization. So, you know, what are you supposed to do about this attack? How are you supposed to combat this? And one, all of the recommendations above. So everything that we have talked about so far, you know, MFA, conditional access, you know, the human factor of checking logs and monitoring, those all apply here, but there are a couple of other key things that you need to take into consideration. So under the Exchange Admin Center and M365, you need to put a policy in place to control automatic forwarding rules in mailboxes. So a lot of times attackers, when they gain, you know, access to a user's credentials, they'll set up automatic forwarding rules. That way anything, in some cases, anything hitting the inbox, they'll send out to an external address, maybe for trade secrets or just general information. Or, you know, if they're looking to do like this business email compromise attack, they'll do a more targeted, you know, forwarding rule that says, hey, any email with the subject containing invoice or account or finance, forward that out. That way they can then social engineer themselves into that conversation and then try to, you know, get some cash out of the process. Now, a couple other things to take into account. You should also have an alert set up inside of Exchange Admin Center that alerts you anytime a rule is created at the inbox level of a mailbox. Maybe you don't want to do that across your entire organization, but maybe your key stakeholders, right? Like your CFO, your CEO. That way, if some weird looking rule gets created on their mailbox, you hear about it and you can take action. And then again, you got to keep an eye on things. You got to take a look at the unified audit log as well. You know, if you do suspect some stuff is happening, the mail tracing is going to be your ultimate end all be all tool for figuring out exactly what is going on there. So with all this information, you can, you know, kind of put together a holistic strategy to at least, maybe while not preventing all of it, you can at least inject yourself into the process and stop it before the attack completes, you know. So that's what you can do for business email compromise attacks. So with that, I think we've covered all of our 5 main areas. One thing that I did want to kind of bring up and share with the attendees today is that we have a new tool available on the iOS and Google Play app stores called Threat Monitor. And Threat Monitor is a free tool, and really what it allows you to do is test the permeability of the Microsoft 365 malware filter, Exchange Online Protection. And a lot of people are unaware that Exchange Online Protection, while it's high, it only has a 99% detection rate, which, you know, at the scale that many organizations get email, 99% actually lets quite a bit of spam and potential hazardous pieces of mail through. So, you know, here at Hornetsecurity, our Threat Monitor application, Total Protection, which I'll talk about here in just a second, we have 99.9% spam detection threshold. And basically, again, like I said, this tool allows you to test the permeability of the malware filter in M365. So the other big thing here, if I'm putting my engineer hat back on, that I really like is that you don't have to change the MX record in order for this tool to work. So you don't have to change the MX record. You don't have to sit there and wait for DNS to propagate. It just works. You just authenticate to your M365 organization, and we can start monitoring and flagging threats as they enter users' mailboxes. And additionally, on top of that, if you do see a threat come into a user's mailbox, you'll get a notification, and you also have the option of deleting that mail right from within the app. So if Bob in accounting, I'm always picking on that guy, but Bob in accounting, if he gets a piece of spam that you don't want him clicking on, and you're sipping margaritas on the beach and you don't want to call anyone, you can open up the app and you can delete that mail, that piece of potentially hazardous mail right from Bob's inbox, right there from the beach. So it's a great little tool. It really helps kind of detect threats as they come into the organization. Highly recommend you check it out. It really helps address that whole phishing concern that we've talked about several times throughout the session today as well. And if you need more holistic protection than that, we also have 365 Total Protection. It's really your full end-to-end security and compliance solution for M365. So, it does spam filtration, advanced threat protection, compliance, signatures and disclaimers. It really is the whole shebang. So definitely check that out. The URL is down there at the bottom of the screen if you're interested in that. If you're looking for additional educational content, on the Altero dojos, we create a whole slew of educational content around Hyper-V, VMware, MSP content, backup and DR. We also have a Office 365 dojo coming, a Azure dojo coming. These days, it's starting to get a little bit easier to answer the question, what don't we talk about, than what we do talk about. So you can get more information there at altero.com/dojo, and you can pick your poison from there. We also have an ebook that was written by a good friend of mine, Paul Schneckenberg. Fantastic resource for Office 365. It really covers the differences as well between what's contained in the Office 365 SKUs, what's contained in the Microsoft 365 SKUs. It also covers a lot of the security stuff that we've talked about today. So you get feature descriptions, installation migration, instructions and help. Really covers all the major components. If you're interested in that ebook, the URL is right there at the bottom of the screen.